The December wind cut through the small town of Ridgewood, Ohio, like a blade, carrying with it the kind of cold that seeps into bones and refuses to leave. The temperature had dropped to 17 degrees, and the weather forecast promised it would get worse before morning. On the corner of Maple Street and Veterans Boulevard, the old VFW hall stood like a sentinel against the encroaching darkness, its American flag snapping violently in the gusts, the sound echoing across the empty parking lot like distant gunfire. The building itself was nothing remarkable, a single-story brick structure with a faded sign above the door and frost creeping up the windows. But to the veterans who gathered there every Thursday night, it was sacred ground. Inside, 30 veterans gathered around plastic tables covered with checkered tablecloths, the aroma of fresh coffee and homemade chili filling the warm air. Christmas decorations hung from the ceiling, strands of colored lights and paper snowflakes that someone's granddaughter had made, giving the room a festive glow that contrasted sharply with the harsh winter night outside. A small artificial tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments collected over decades, each one representing a memory, a fallen comrade, a moment worth preserving. Laughter bounced off the wood-paneled walls decorated with photographs from conflicts spanning 7 decades. These men and women had served in Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, and Iraq. They had seen things that most people only read about in history books, and every Thursday night they came together to find comfort in the company of those who understood without needing explanations. The room buzzed with conversation and camaraderie. Old jokes were told for the 100th time, and everyone laughed anyway because the laughter itself was the point. War stories were shared, some of them embellished beyond recognition, others painfully, quietly true. There was talk of grandchildren and doctor appointments and the latest outrages on the news, the ordinary concerns of people who had once been extraordinary in ways that most civilians could never comprehend. But outside, in the bitter cold, sat a boy who had seen his own kind of war. His name was Marcus Johnson. He was 12 years old, though the hollowness in his eyes made him look much older, made him look like he had lived several lifetimes already and had found them all wanting. He sat with his back pressed against the brick wall of the VFW hall, his knees pulled tight to his chest, trying to conserve whatever body heat remained in his thin frame. His jacket, a faded blue thing 3 sizes too big that he had found in a dumpster behind a thrift store, was missing most of its buttons and offered little protection against the relentless wind. The collar was frayed, and there was a tear along one seam that let the cold slip through like a knife. His sneakers had holes in the soles where the rubber had worn through completely, and he had stuffed newspaper inside them to keep his feet from going completely numb. His jeans were too short, exposing his ankles to the bitter air, and his socks, which had once been white, were now a greyish-brown from weeks of wear without washing. His face was chapped and red from the wind, his lips cracked and bleeding in the corners. His dark hair, unwashed and matted, stuck out from beneath a knit cap that had lost most of its elasticity and kept sliding down over his eyes. His hands, tucked under his armpits for warmth, were so cold that he had stopped feeling them an hour ago, which frightened him more than he wanted to admit. He knew about frostbite from a book he had read once, back when reading books was a normal part of his life, and he knew that when you stopped feeling your fingers, bad things were happening inside them. Marcus had been sitting there for 2 hours, watching the veterans arrive one by one, their cars pulling into the parking lot, their breath forming clouds as they hurried inside. He watched them embrace at the door, pat each other on the back, and disappear into the warmth that seemed as unreachable to him as the stars above. He was not there by accident. He was there because of a story his father used to tell him, back when his father was still alive, back when life made sense. Before you continue watching, if you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more inspiring stories just like this one. Now, let's continue. Marcus's father, Staff Sergeant Derek Johnson, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He used to tell Marcus about the brotherhood he found in the military, how those bonds were forged in fire and could never be broken. He spoke of the VFW as a place where veterans looked out for each other, where no one was ever turned away, where the spirit of service continued long after the uniform came off. Derek would sit on the edge of Marcus's bed at night, his voice low and warm, and tell stories that made the military sound like a family larger than any Marcus could imagine. "When you serve together," Derek would say, "when you go through what we went through, you become brothers and sisters in a way that civilians can't understand. It's not about politics or flag waving or any of that stuff. It's about the person next to you. It's about knowing that they've got your back and you've got theirs, no matter what." Derek had stories for every occasion. Stories about the friends he had made, the places he had seen, the moments of terror and the moments of unexpected beauty. He told Marcus about watching the sun rise over the mountains of Afghanistan, how the light turned the snowcaps pink and gold. He told him about the interpreter who had saved his squad's life by noticing a tripwire that everyone else had missed. He told him about the children in the villages who would run alongside their convoys, waving and shouting, their faces full of hope that the American soldiers would make their lives better. But Derek also had darker stories, ones he saved for late nights when Marcus's mother was asleep and the house was quiet. Stories about friends who did not come home. Stories about the things he had seen and done that still visited him in his dreams. Stories about the price of service, the invisible wounds that never fully healed. "War changes you," Derek told Marcus once, his eyes distant and haunted. "It takes something from you that you can never get back, but it also gives you something. It gives you perspective. It shows you what really matters." Derek had died 18 months ago, not in battle, but in a car accident on Highway 42 during a thunderstorm. He had been on his way home from a job interview, his 3rd that week, still struggling to find his place in the civilian world. The transition from military to civilian life had been harder than anyone expected. Derek's skills, honed in combat, did not translate easily to the peacetime economy. He was overqualified for entry-level positions and underqualified, at least on paper, for the management roles that his leadership experience should have earned him. The rejections piled up, each one a small wound to his pride and his sense of self. The night he died, Derek had called Linda from the road. "I think this one's going to work out," he had said, excitement in his voice for the first time in months. The interviewer was a veteran too. "He gets it. He said they'd call tomorrow with an offer." That call never came. Instead, there was a knock on the door at 2 in the morning, a state trooper with rain dripping from his hat and sorrow in his eyes. The tractor-trailer had jackknifed across the wet pavement. Derek's car had hydroplaned, spinning out of control. Derek never stood a chance. After that, everything fell apart. Marcus's mother, Linda, tried to hold things together. She was a strong woman, everyone said so, the kind of woman who had kept the home front running through 2 deployments, who had raised Marcus through his father's absences, who had always believed that things would work out in the end. She worked double shifts at the diner, her feet aching and her back screaming by the end of each day. She took in laundry from the neighbors, spending her few free hours bent over an ironing board. She did whatever she could to keep a roof over their heads, to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Marcus, to prove that they could survive without Derek. But grief is a heavy thing, and Linda carried it poorly. She started drinking, just a little at first. A glass of wine at night to help her sleep, a shot of whiskey to take the edge off after a particularly hard shift. The funeral expenses had drained their savings. The life insurance payout, which should have been enough to sustain them, got tangled up in paperwork that seemed designed to delay and deny. Bills arrived like clockwork, indifferent to tragedy, and Linda faced the terrible math of poverty, choosing between electricity and food, between medicine and rent. Then more drinking, then too much. The glasses of wine became bottles, the shots of whiskey became half-pints, then pints. Linda started missing shifts at work, calling in sick when she was really too hungover to stand. Her manager, who had been sympathetic at first, began running out of patience. The neighbors stopped bringing their laundry over after Linda scorched 3 shirts in a row because she had passed out with the iron still on. Marcus watched his mother disappear inside herself, the woman who had always been there for him, who had helped with homework and made pancakes on Saturday mornings and held him when he cried about missing his father. That woman was being replaced by a stranger who slept until noon and forgot to buy groceries. A stranger who looked at Marcus with glassy eyes and sometimes did not seem to recognize him at all. "I'm fine," Linda would say when Marcus asked if she was okay. "I just need to rest. Everything's going to be fine." But everything was not fine, and they both knew it. The bills piled up. The landlord lost patience. 6 months after Derek's death, they were evicted. For a while, they stayed with Linda's sister in Columbus, but that arrangement soured quickly. Aunt Diane was not a bad person, but she had her own struggles, her own family to worry about. Her house was already crowded with her 3 kids, and adding Linda and Marcus meant converting the living room into a bedroom, meant stretching meals that were already modest, meant sharing 1 bathroom among 7 people. Her sister's husband, Carl, made his displeasure known from the start. He was a man of few words, but his silences spoke volumes. He sighed loudly whenever Linda opened the refrigerator. He made pointed comments about people who needed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. He left job listings on Linda's pillow, circled in red marker, with notes like "no experience necessary" and "they're always hiring." Marcus tried to make himself invisible. He stayed in his corner of the living room, did his homework quietly, helped with dishes without being asked. He avoided Carl's eyes and answered every question with "yes, sir" and "no, sir," trying to be the perfect houseguest, trying not to give anyone a reason to kick them out. But the arguments grew louder and more frequent. Linda and Diane had always had a complicated relationship, and poverty exposed every fault line that had ever existed between them. There were fights about drinking, about responsibility, about whose fault everything was. There were accusations thrown like weapons, words that could not be taken back. One night, after a particularly vicious argument that ended with Diane crying in the kitchen and Carl slamming the bedroom door so hard the whole house shook, Linda packed their bags and they left, promising Marcus that things would get better, that they just needed a fresh start. But fresh starts require resources, and Linda had none left to give. They lived in the car for 3 months, moving from parking lot to parking lot, trying to stay invisible. Their car was an old Honda Civic with 160,000 miles on it and a heater that only worked intermittently. Marcus learned to layer all his clothes when he slept, to wedge himself between the front seats where the air was slightly warmer, to ignore the way his breath frosted the windows on the coldest nights. Linda's drinking got worse. Some nights she would disappear for hours, leaving Marcus alone in the back seat, watching shadows move across the windows, his heart racing at every sound. A tap on the glass, a distant shout, the wail of sirens, each one a reminder that they were vulnerable, exposed, prey for anyone who wanted to take advantage. Marcus learned to keep a knife under his pillow, a small pocket knife that had belonged to his father. He never had to use it, but the weight of it in his hand helped him feel less helpless. He learned which parking lots were safe and which ones attracted the kind of people who looked at a sleeping boy and saw opportunity. He learned that Walmart was usually okay, that church parking lots were hit or miss, that the lot behind the truck stop on Route 23 was to be avoided at all costs. Some nights, strangers would tap on the window, curious faces peering in, sometimes concerned, sometimes predatory. Marcus learned to keep his head down, to pretend he was asleep, to wait for them to move on. He learned that most people did not want trouble. They just wanted to know if you were alive or dead, and once they confirmed the former, they went about their business. But some people did want trouble. There was a night when 3 teenagers surrounded the car, banging on the windows and rocking it back and forth, while Marcus huddled in the back seat and prayed they would go away. There was another night when a man tried the door handle, found it unlocked because the lock was broken, and Marcus had to scream and kick until the man retreated into the darkness. After that, Linda started sleeping with a tire iron across her lap. Then 2 weeks ago, the car was repossessed. They had been behind on payments for months. Marcus woke up to the sound of a tow truck hooking up their last piece of shelter and dragging it away into the pre-dawn darkness. Linda broke down that day. She sat on the curb and sobbed, and for the first time Marcus saw his mother not as a parent, but as a broken human being who had lost everything she had ever held dear. That night, they slept under a bridge, huddled together for warmth, and when Marcus woke the next morning, his mother was gone. She had left a note, scrawled on the back of a gas station receipt. "I'm sorry, baby, I'm going to get help. Stay safe. I love you, Mom." That was 12 days ago. Marcus had not seen or heard from her since. He had wandered for days, surviving on food from dumpsters behind restaurants, sleeping in doorways and abandoned buildings, always moving, always afraid. The first night after his mother left, he had stayed under the bridge where they had been sleeping, waiting for her to come back. He told himself she had just gone to find help, that she would return any minute, that this was all a misunderstanding. By the second day, he knew she was not coming back, at least not soon. He read her note again and again, until the words were burned into his memory. "I'm going to get help." What kind of help? Where? For how long? He learned to survive on the streets, though it felt less like learning and more like instinct taking over. His body knew things his mind did not want to admit. It knew that the dumpster behind the Italian restaurant on 5th Street was emptied on Tuesday and Friday nights, right after closing, which meant the food was still relatively fresh. It knew that the doorway of the abandoned movie theater provided shelter from the wind, but attracted other homeless people who did not always welcome company. It knew that walking with purpose, even when you had nowhere to go, made people less likely to stop you and ask questions. He learned to avoid certain streets where older kids would rob him of whatever little he had. There was a group of teenagers who hung out near the overpass, and they had a reputation for violence that preceded them. Marcus gave them a wide berth, even when it meant walking an extra mile to get where he was going. He learned which convenience store clerks would chase him away, and which ones would look the other way, while he warmed himself by the coffee machines. There was a clerk at the Gas and Go on Madison Avenue, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, who never said anything when Marcus stood by the hot dog roller for 20 minutes, just trying to absorb some heat. Once, she had left a wrapped sandwich on the counter when she went to the back room, and when she returned, it was gone, and Marcus was nowhere to be seen. She never mentioned it, and he never stopped being grateful. He learned the rhythms of the city, the patterns that governed survival. Mornings were dangerous because that was when the business people were out, rushing to work, intolerant of anything that slowed them down. A homeless kid on the sidewalk was just an obstacle to be avoided, or worse, a problem to be reported. But evenings were better. People coming home from work were tired, distracted, and less likely to pay attention to a boy who walked like he knew where he was going. But through all of it, he remembered his father's stories about the VFW. He remembered the warmth in his father's voice when he talked about his brothers and sisters in arms. And somewhere in his 12-year-old mind, Marcus convinced himself that if he could just get to a VFW hall, someone there would help him, someone there would know what to do. It was not a plan, exactly. It was more like faith, faith in something his father had believed in, something that had given his father strength through 2 deployments and the difficult return home. Marcus clung to that faith because he had nothing else to cling to. So he had walked for 3 days, following signs toward the small town of Ridgewood, where he had seen a VFW hall listed on a tattered directory at a rest stop. He had found the directory by accident, looking for a bathroom that he could use without being chased away. The list of VFW halls was on a board by the door, faded and outdated, but Ridgewood was only 30 miles away. 30 miles was walkable, 30 miles was possible. His feet were blistered by the end of the first day, raw wounds that made every step agony. His stomach ached with hunger, a constant gnawing that never quite went away even when he found food. His body trembled from the cold, a tremor that started in his core and radiated outward until his teeth chattered and his hands shook. But he kept walking because he had nothing else left to believe in. On the second day, a trucker had offered him a ride. The man had pulled over on the shoulder, his big rig idling, and called out the window. "Where you headed, kid?" Marcus had almost said yes. He was so tired, so cold, so desperate for a few miles of warmth and rest. But something stopped him. A memory of his mother's voice, back when she was still herself, warning him about strangers. A survival instinct that whispered caution even when his body screamed for relief. "I'm okay," he had said, backing away from the truck. "My dad's picking me up just ahead." The trucker had shrugged and driven on, and Marcus had stood on the shoulder of the road, shaking, unsure if he had made the right decision. The truck might have been safe. The driver might have been a good man, but Marcus could not afford to be wrong. Not now. Not when he had come so far. He slept that night in a drainage culvert off the highway, curled into the tightest ball he could manage, listening to the cars roar past overhead. The concrete was cold and hard, and he woke several times, shivering so violently he thought his bones might crack. But morning came, as mornings do, and he got up and kept walking. And now here he was, sitting outside the hall, too scared to go inside, too cold to leave. Inside the VFW hall, the Thursday night gathering was in full swing. Sergeant Major Harold Big Mac McAllister, 73 years old and built like a refrigerator despite the years that had passed since his active duty days, was holding court at the center table, regaling the younger veterans with stories from his days in Vietnam. His booming laugh filled the room, and those around him hung on every word. Big Mac had a gift for storytelling that turned even the darkest memories into something bearable, something that could be shared and examined without crumbling under its own weight. "So there I am," Big Mac was saying, his massive hands gesturing broadly, knee-deep in rice paddy water, mosquitoes eating me alive, and my sergeant tells me we've got to cross another 3 clicks before dark. 3 clicks, in that heat. I looked at him and said, "Sarge, I joined the Marines to see the world, not to die in a swamp that smells like rotten eggs." The table erupted in laughter. Everyone there knew the rest of the story. How Big Mac had made those 3 clicks and another 2 besides. How he had carried his wounded buddy the last mile. How he had earned his first commendation in that very swamp. But it was not the outcome that mattered. It was the telling. It was the connection. At the corner table, former Army medic Elena Rodriguez sat with her husband Miguel, also a veteran. They were discussing the upcoming holiday food drive, making lists of supplies they would need to collect. Elena had served in Afghanistan, where she had saved the lives of countless soldiers, her steady hands and quick thinking making the difference between life and death on dozens of occasions. She had brought that same dedication to service home with her, channeling it into volunteer work and community organizing. Miguel had his own stories, his own scars, but he preferred to let Eleanor take the lead. He was happiest when he was supporting her, making sure she had everything she needed to do the work she loved. "We need at least 50 turkeys," Eleanor was saying, tapping her pen against the notebook. "Last year, we ran out before we got to everyone on the list. That can't happen again." 50 turkeys is a lot, Miguel observed. "Then we'll get 60. Better to have too many than not enough." Near the bar, Navy veteran James Whitey Whitmore was pouring coffee for anyone who wanted it. At 61, he had been a fixture at this VFW hall for 2 decades, ever since he retired from a career that had taken him to every ocean on Earth. He knew everyone by name, knew their stories, knew their struggles. He considered it his personal mission to make sure no veteran ever felt alone, that every person who walked through those doors found a welcome that matched the service they had given. Whitey had a particular gift for remembering the details that mattered. He knew that Joe Simmons took his coffee black because the cream reminded him of something he did not want to remember. He knew that Martha Chen needed to sit with her back to the wall because open spaces behind her made her nervous. He knew that the young kid from the Marines, Tommy something, needed someone to check in on him because he was struggling with the transition and too proud to ask for help. These were the small acts of service that Whitey believed in. Not grand gestures, but consistent presence. Not fixing people, but being there while they fixed themselves. There were other veterans scattered around the room, each with their own stories and their own reasons for being there. There was Sandra, who had driven trucks through Iraq and now drove a school bus, channeling the same protective instincts that had kept her convoy safe into keeping 60 children safe every morning and afternoon. There was Paul, who had been a helicopter mechanic in Desert Storm, and now ran a small repair shop that he kept open late on Thursdays so he could make it to these meetings. There was young Destiny, barely 25, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and was still figuring out who she was going to be now that she was not a soldier anymore. They were all different, these veterans, different ages, different branches, different wars, but something bound them together, something that transcended the differences. They had all raised their right hands and taken an oath. They had all been willing to give their lives for something larger than themselves. And that willingness, whether or not it had been tested, had marked them forever. But it was Frank Delgado who first noticed the boy. Frank was 65, a former Marine who had served in the Gulf War with a distinction that he rarely talked about and medals that he kept in a box in his closet. He had stepped outside for a cigarette, a habit he had been trying to quit for 30 years without success, and the cold hit him like a physical force. The contrast between the warmth inside and the bitter air outside made him gasp involuntarily. He fished in his jacket pocket for his lighter, found it, and cupped his hands around the flame. The cigarette caught on the 3rd try, and Frank inhaled gratefully, feeling the smoke warm his lungs. He knew it was bad for him. His doctor had told him 100 times, but some habits were harder to break than others, and this one had seen him through a lot of dark nights. Frank was about to head back inside when he noticed the small figure huddled against the wall. At first, he thought it was just a pile of clothes, maybe something someone had dropped or left behind. Then, the pile moved, and Frank's breath caught in his throat. He walked closer, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, the sound loud in the stillness of the night. His Marine training kicked in automatically, assessing the situation, looking for threats, cataloguing details. Small figure, child, probably, alone, no sign of parents or guardians, inadequate clothing for the conditions, signs of exposure. The boy looked up at him, and Frank felt something twist in his chest, those eyes. He had seen those eyes before, in the faces of refugees in Kuwait, in the faces of children who had lost everything they ever had. It was a look of exhausted hope, the kind that expects nothing but cannot quite surrender, the kind that keeps looking for help even after help has failed to arrive again and again. Frank had seen a lot of things in his 65 years. He had seen combat and death and the terrible things that humans do to each other. He had seen poverty and despair and the slow, grinding destruction of lives that no one cared enough to save. But something about this boy, this small figure huddled against the wall of a VFW hall in the freezing cold, hit him harder than any of it. Maybe it was the age. The boy could not be more than 12 or 13, too young to be out here alone, too young to have that look in his eyes. Maybe it was the setting. This was the VFW hall, sacred ground for veterans, and finding a homeless child on their doorstep felt like a message, a challenge, a test of everything they claimed to believe. Or maybe it was just that Frank was tired of walking past problems, tired of telling himself that someone else would handle it, tired of being the kind of person who looked the other way. "Hey there, son," Frank said, his voice gruff but not unkind. The words felt inadequate, but he did not know what else to say. "What are you doing out here?" Marcus did not answer. He had learned that talking to strangers often led to trouble. Adults asked questions, and questions led to calls to social services, and social services meant being separated from whatever remained of his life. Frank took a drag from his cigarette, studying the boy. The kid was young, probably not even a teenager. His clothes were inadequate for the weather, and Frank could see that he was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard it was audible. "You hungry?" Frank asked. Marcus's stomach answered before he could stop it, growling loudly in the silence. Frank nodded as if that settled things. "Come on inside. We've got food." Marcus shook his head, pressing himself harder against the wall. "No one's going to hurt you in there," Frank said. "It's just a bunch of old soldiers eating chili and telling lies. Safest place in town." Marcus looked at the door of the VFW hall, then back at Frank. Something in the older man's face reminded him of his father. It was not the features, but the steadiness, the way Frank looked at him directly, without pity or judgment. "My dad was a soldier," Marcus said, the first words he had spoken in days. His voice cracked from disuse. Frank's expression softened. "Was he?" Marcus nodded. "Staff Sergeant Derek Johnson. He served in Afghanistan." The name hit Frank like a sucker punch. He stood very still for a moment, the cigarette forgotten in his hand. Then he crouched down to Marcus's level, his knees protesting the movement. "Derek Johnson," he repeated slowly. "From Columbus?" Marcus's eyes widened. "You knew my dad?" Frank felt a lump forming in his throat. He had never met Derek Johnson in person, but he knew the name. Every veteran in this part of Ohio knew the name. Derek Johnson had been a hero, awarded the Bronze Star for saving his entire squad during an ambush near Kandahar. His death had been reported in the local papers, and the VFW had sent flowers to the funeral. And now his son was sitting outside their hall, alone, freezing, clearly homeless. Frank reached out and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Come inside, son, right now." This time Marcus did not resist. The reaction inside the VFW hall was immediate and overwhelming. When Frank walked through the door, with the shivering boy beside him, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the entrance. The room, which had been alive with laughter and camaraderie moments before, went suddenly silent. It was not hostility that filled that silence. It was something else, recognition maybe. Every person in that room had seen vulnerability before, had been vulnerable themselves in ways that civilians could not understand. They knew what it looked like when someone was at the end of their rope, and they could see it in this boy as clearly as if he were wearing a sign. "This is Marcus Johnson," Frank announced, his voice carrying across the room. He kept one hand on Marcus's shoulder, a protective gesture that was as much for himself as for the boy. "Derek Johnson's son." The name hung in the air for a moment. Derek Johnson, Staff Sergeant Derek Johnson, who had saved his entire squad during an ambush near Kandahar. Derek Johnson, whose death had been reported in the local papers, whose funeral had been attended by veterans from 3 counties. Derek Johnson, whose widow and son had apparently fallen through the cracks that society pretended did not exist. A moment of stunned silence. Then Big Mac was on his feet, crossing the room with surprising speed for a man his size. His chair scraped against the floor with a screech that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Elena Rodriguez was right behind him, her medic instincts kicking in as she assessed the boy's condition with practiced eyes, noting the pallor of his skin, the blue tinge around his lips, the way his hands trembled even as he tried to hide them in his pockets. "Good Lord," Elena said, kneeling in front of Marcus so that she was at his eye level. Her voice was calm and professional, but there was a crack in it that revealed the emotion underneath. "He's hypothermic. Whitey, get me some blankets from the closet. Someone start warming up that soup. Not too hot, we need to raise his core temperature gradually." The hall burst into motion. Veterans who had been sitting moments ago were now moving with purpose, their training taking over in a way that felt as natural as breathing. One grabbed blankets from the storage closet in the back. Another headed for the kitchen where the chili had been simmering. A third was already pulling chairs together near the heating vent, creating a warm space for the boy to sit. Someone turned up the thermostat. Someone else started boiling water for tea. Paul, the helicopter mechanic, stripped off his own jacket and handed it to Frank without a word, gesturing toward the boy. These were people who knew how to respond to emergencies, who had been trained to act when others froze, and they fell into that mode without hesitation. Marcus stood frozen in the middle of all this activity, overwhelmed and bewildered. He had expected to be turned away, or at worst, have the police called on him. He had been prepared for rejection, had steeled himself against it, had told himself that if this place did not help him, he would find somewhere else somehow. He had not expected this. He had not expected 30 strangers to mobilize on his behalf like he was a mission worth fighting for. Big Mac appeared in front of him, his massive frame blocking out the light. The old sergeant's face, weathered by decades of sun and wind and war, was creased with concern that looked almost out of place on features more accustomed to stoic endurance. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle, gentler than Marcus would have believed possible from such a large man. "Your daddy was a hero, son. We don't leave our own out in the cold. Not ever. Not while there's breath in our bodies." Elena wrapped a blanket around Marcus's shoulders, guiding him toward the warmest spot in the room. She knelt in front of him, checking his hands and feet for frostbite, asking questions in a calm, professional tone. "How long were you out there, sweetheart?" "A couple hours," Marcus managed to say. "And before that, where have you been staying?" Marcus hesitated. He looked around at all the faces watching him, these strangers who had suddenly become so concerned with his welfare. The kindness was almost harder to handle than the cold. "Around," he said finally, "different places." Elena and Frank exchanged a look that communicated volumes. Elena turned back to Marcus, her dark eyes warm with compassion. "Are you here alone? Where's your mom?" The question broke something inside Marcus. His face crumpled, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to cry. The tears came silently at first, then in great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Elena pulled him into her arms without hesitation. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now. Whatever it is, we're going to figure it out together." The room fell silent except for the sound of Marcus's crying. 30 veterans stood or sat in various positions, watching this scene unfold, and not one of them was unmoved. These were men and women who had faced down enemy fire, who had buried friends, who had seen the worst of humanity. But there was something about a crying child that cut through every defense. Whitey appeared with a steaming bowl of chili and a glass of water. He set them on the table near Marcus and stepped back, his weathered face creased with concern. "Let him eat," Elena said softly. "Give him some space." The veterans dispersed slightly, giving Marcus room to breathe, but none of them left. They formed a loose circle around him, a protective perimeter of grizzled warriors standing guard over a broken child. Marcus ate slowly at first, then with increasing desperation. The chili was hot and hearty, filled with beans and meat and vegetables. It was the first real meal he had eaten in nearly 2 weeks, and his starving body welcomed it with pathetic gratitude. While he ate, Frank pulled the senior members of the post into a huddle near the bar. Big Mac, Elena, Miguel, Whitey, and a few others gathered close, speaking in low voices. "We need to call someone," Whitey said. "CPS, the police, somebody." "Not yet," Frank said firmly. "We don't know the whole story. Let's get the kid warm and fed and find out what we're dealing with. Then we can make decisions." "The law says we have to report," Whitey argued. "He's a minor, clearly abandoned or run away. We could get in serious trouble." Big Mac held up a hand. "We've been through wars together. I think we can handle a little trouble. Frank's right. Let's hear the boy's story first." Elena nodded in agreement. "He's traumatized. Pushing him too fast will just make things worse. He needs to feel safe before he'll open up." The group broke up, and they returned to their positions around the room, trying to project normalcy while their minds churned with questions and concerns. Over the next hour, the story came out in pieces. Marcus, warmed by the blankets and fortified by the food, began to talk. At first, the words came slowly, haltingly, as if he was not sure they would be welcome. But the veterans listened without interrupting, without judging, and gradually the dam broke. He told them about his father's death, about the phone call that never came, about the state trooper at the door with rain dripping from his hat. He described the funeral, how the flag had been folded and presented to his mother, how she had held it to her chest like it was the last piece of derrick she would ever touch. He remembered the sound of the bugle playing taps, how it had echoed across the cemetery, how his mother had sobbed so hard she could barely stand. He told them about his mother's decline, about the glasses of wine that became bottles, about the missed shifts and the unpaid bills, and the slow erosion of everything that had once been stable in his life. He did not blame her, even now. He had learned, in the months since his father's death, that people broke in different ways, and his mother had broken in a way that left her unable to put herself back together. He told them about the eviction, about coming home from school to find their belongings piled on the curb, about the landlord's impassive face as he changed the locks. He described the feeling of standing on the sidewalk with nowhere to go, of watching strangers drive past without looking, of realizing that the world was going to continue spinning whether or not he had a place in it. He told them about living with Aunt Diane, about Carl's sighs and pointed comments, about the fights that escalated until staying was no longer possible. He described the night they left, how his mother had thrown their bags in the car with hands that shook, how she had promised him everything would be okay, even though her eyes said something different. He told them about the car, about the parking lots and the rest stops, and the nights spent huddled in the back seat trying to stay warm. He described the fear that became so constant it almost felt like background noise, the way every shadow could hide a threat, every noise could be the beginning of something terrible. He told them about waking up to find his mother gone, about the note, about the 12 days of wandering that had brought him to their door. By the time he finished, his voice was hoarse and his face was wet with tears, but he felt lighter than he had in months. For the first time since his father died, he had told someone the truth, the whole truth, and they had not turned away. By the time he finished, there was not a dry eye in the house. Even Big Mac, who had not cried since Vietnam, who had buried friends and comrades and pieces of himself in that distant jungle, was surreptitiously wiping his face with a handkerchief the size of a small flag. The other veterans had stopped even pretending to be stoic. Sandra was openly weeping. Young Destiny had her face in her hands. Paul kept clearing his throat and looking at the ceiling, as if the tears would stop if he just refused to acknowledge them. That woman, someone muttered, their voice thick with emotion. How could she just leave her kid like that? She's sick, Elena said sharply, though her own cheeks were wet. Addiction is a disease. It does things to your brain, changes the way you think. Don't forget that. She didn't abandon him because she doesn't love him. She abandoned him because she thought she was too broken to take care of him. It was a distinction that mattered, even if it did not change anything. Linda had made a terrible choice, but she had made it because she was drowning, because she could not see another way. That did not excuse it, but it explained it, and explanation was the first step toward understanding. Frank was pacing near the bar, his mind working through possibilities. Do we have any way to find her? The mother, Linda? Marcus shook his head. I don't know where she went. She said she was going to get help, but I don't know what that means. Could be rehab, Miguel suggested. There's a place up in Toledo, Veterans Family Services. They take in family members of service members. We need to make some calls, Big Mac said. He looked at Marcus. Son, we're going to find your mama. In the meantime, you're staying with us. With you? Marcus's voice was small and uncertain. Big Mac smiled, and it transformed his craggy face. This is the VFW, kid. We stand for Veterans of Foreign Wars, but it also means family. Your daddy was one of us, which means you're one of us too, and we take care of our own. The veterans mobilized with the same efficiency they had shown in their military days. Phone calls were made. Messages were sent. Within an hour, half the post was working various angles, trying to track down Linda Johnson, while the other half focused on taking care of Marcus. Elena's sister, who was not a veteran but was married to one, arrived with a bag of warm clothes that had belonged to her own son before he outgrew them. The clothes were not new, but they were clean and whole and the right size. Marcus changed in the bathroom, and when he emerged, he looked almost like a normal kid instead of a refugee. Whitey organized a collection on the spot. Veterans emptied their pockets, and within 20 minutes, they had gathered over $800 in cash. The money would go toward whatever Marcus needed, whether that was food, shelter, or helping his mother get treatment. But the question of where Marcus would sleep that night loomed large. He can stay with me, Frank said. I've got a spare room. It's not fancy, but it's warm and safe. We should rotate, Eleanor suggested. Share the responsibility. That way no one person is overwhelmed. I don't want to be any trouble, Marcus said quietly. He had been listening to the adults talk, watching them organize his life with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. I can go back outside. I'll be okay. The silence that followed was deafening. Big Mac walked over and crouched in front of Marcus, meeting his eyes. Listen to me, son. You are not trouble. You are family. Derek Johnson saved lives over in Afghanistan. He was a hero, and heroes' kids don't sleep outside. Not while we're breathing. You understand me? Marcus nodded, his eyes filling with tears again. Good. Now you're going home with Frank tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps. But I promise you, on my honor as a Marine, we are not going to abandon you. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The drive to Frank's house was quiet. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket, watching the dark streets of Ridgewood slide past the window. Frank kept his eyes on the road, giving the boy space. Frank's house was a modest ranch-style home on a quiet street. Inside, it was clean but sparse, decorated with military memorabilia and photographs of Frank with his fellow Marines. There was no sign of a woman's touch. Frank had been divorced for 15 years, and his ex-wife had taken most of the furniture when she left. The spare room's down the hall, Frank said. Bathroom's next to it. There's towels in the closet if you want to take a shower, and help yourself to anything in the fridge. Marcus nodded, clutching the bag of donated clothes. Thank you, sir. Frank paused at the doorway. You don't have to call me sir. Frank will do just fine. Thank you, Frank. The older man nodded and headed for his own room, but sleep was a long time coming. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Derek Johnson and the cruel randomness of fate. Derek had survived war, only to die on an Ohio highway. His widow had crumbled under the weight of grief, and now his son was sleeping in the house of a stranger, orphaned in all but name. Life could be unforgivably brutal sometimes, but life could also surprise you. Frank had seen enough of both to know that giving up was not an option. Tomorrow, they would start searching for Linda Johnson in earnest. They would contact veterans services, addiction treatment centers, homeless shelters. They would post her picture on social media and reach out to every connection they had. And if they could not find her, well, they would figure something out. The VFW had done harder things than take care of one lost boy. In the spare room, Marcus lay awake in the unfamiliar bed. It was soft, much softer than the ground he had been sleeping on. The blankets were warm and the house was quiet, except for the hum of the heater. He should have felt safe, but instead, he felt untethered, like he might float away at any moment. He thought about his mother. Where was she right now? Was she warm? Was she scared? Did she miss him? He thought about his father, about the stories he used to tell, about the way he would swing Marcus up onto his shoulders and parade him around the backyard like a conquering hero. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, some other boy who had lived a different life. Marcus closed his eyes and made a wish. He wished that his mother would get better. He wished that he could go home, even though there was no home left to go to. He wished that things could be the way they were before, even though he knew deep down that the past was a country he could never revisit. Finally, exhausted beyond measure, he fell asleep. The next morning brought activity. Frank made breakfast, bacon and eggs and toast, and Marcus ate with an appetite that made the older man smile, despite the gravity of the situation. "We're going to the VFW hall this morning," Frank said. "The guys have been making calls since last night. We might have a lead on your mother." Marcus's head shot up. "You found her?" "Maybe. Don't get your hopes up too high yet. But there's a Veterans Family Treatment Center in Toledo that admitted a woman matching your mother's description about 10 days ago. They're checking the records." For the first time since Frank had found him outside the hall, Marcus felt something other than despair. It was small and fragile, this new feeling, and he was almost afraid to acknowledge it. But it was there, flickering in his chest like a candle in the wind. Hope. At the VFW hall, the atmosphere was charged with purpose. Veterans who had been enjoying their retirement were now working phones and computers like it was a military operation. Big Mac had set up a command center at one of the tables, coordinating efforts with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. "Toledo is confirmed," he announced as Frank and Marcus walked in. "There's a woman named Linda Johnson at the Veterans Family Treatment Center. She checked herself in 11 days ago." Marcus let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "She's alive!" "She's alive and in treatment," Big Mac confirmed. "The center is going to arrange a phone call later today. They need to clear it with her therapist first, make sure she's stable enough." Elena approached Marcus with a warm smile. "That's good news, sweetheart. Your mom is getting the help she needs." "Can I see her?" Marcus asked. "Can I go there?" Big Mac shook his head. "Not yet. Treatment centers have rules about visitors, especially in the first few weeks, but you'll be able to talk to her, and when she's ready, they'll arrange a visit." It was not everything Marcus wanted, but it was more than he had dared to hope for. His mother was alive. She had kept her promise. She had gone to get help. The phone call came at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The treatment center had set up a secure line, and Marcus was given privacy in Big Mac's office to talk to his mother. The office was small, cluttered with papers and memorabilia, but it felt like a sanctuary, a place where important things could be said without witnesses. The veterans waited outside, pacing and checking their watches, as nervous as if it were their own family on the line. They had done many things together over the years, these men and women. They had shared grief and joy, and the mundane moments in between. But this felt different. This felt like something that could break or heal in equal measure, and they were all holding their breath. Inside the office, Marcus held the phone with trembling hands. The receiver was old and heavy, a relic from a time before cell phones, and it felt solid in his grip. Real, tangible, unlike so much else in his life lately. The phone rang once, twice, then a click and a voice. "Marcus, baby, is that you?" The sound of his mother's voice hit Marcus like a wave. It had only been 2 weeks since he had heard it, but it felt like a lifetime, like years had passed, like he had crossed an ocean to get back to this moment. "Mom," his voice broke. "Mom, where are you? I was so scared." "I know, baby, I know. I'm so sorry." Linda's voice was different than he remembered, clearer somehow, more present. The fog that had clouded it for months, the slurring and the confusion and the disconnection, was gone. This was his mother, as she had been before, as she had been when his father was alive. "I should never have left you like that. But I was so sick, Marcus. I couldn't take care of you when I couldn't even take care of myself. Where did you go?" There was a pause on the line, a breath drawn in, a moment of gathering. I checked myself into a treatment center, for the drinking and for the depression. I've been here for almost 2 weeks now. Marcus felt his knees go weak. He sank into Big Mac's chair, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Are you getting better?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'm trying, baby, I'm really trying. It's hard, harder than anything I've ever done. Some days I wake up and I want to give up, want to walk out that door and never look back. But then I think about you. I think about your face. I think about the way you used to look at me like I was the center of the world. And I can't give up." "Not while you're out there waiting for me." Marcus was crying now, tears streaming down his face, but he did not care. "The veterans found me, Mom. Dad's friends. They took me in. They've been feeding me and keeping me warm, and they found you." Linda was crying too. He could hear it in her voice, the hitch and the tremor and the wet sound of grief mixed with relief. "Your father always said the VFW was family. I should have remembered that. I should have taken you there instead of what I did." "It's okay, Mom." The words felt strange in his mouth, felt too big and too small at the same time. It was not okay. What she had done was not okay. But he did not want to make her feel worse. He wanted her to get better. Just get better. Please just get better. "I will, Marcus, I promise. I'm going to finish this program, and then I'm going to find a job, and we're going to have a home again. A real home, with a kitchen where I can make you breakfast, and a living room where we can watch movies, and a backyard where you can play. I know I've broken a lot of promises, baby, but this one I'm going to keep." They talked for 20 more minutes until the center's allotted time ran out. By the end, Marcus was emotionally wrung out, but the hollowness that had lived in his chest for so long was starting to fill with something else. Belief. Belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. When Marcus emerged from the office, he found all 30 veterans waiting in the hall. They looked at him with expectant faces, these grizzled warriors who had adopted him as one of their own. "She's okay," Marcus said, his voice thick. "She's getting help. She says she's going to get better." A cheer went up from the crowd. Big Mac clapped his massive hands together, Whitey pumped his fist in the air, and Elena pulled Marcus into a hug that lasted a long time. "That's step 1, Big Mac announced. "Now we figure out step 2. The kid needs a stable place to stay until his mother finishes treatment. That's going to be at least a few months." "He can stay with me," Frank said immediately. "And me when Frank needs a break," Elena added. "Me too," said another veteran. "And me. Count me in." Within minutes, they had organized a rotation. Marcus would stay with Frank primarily, but other veterans would step in as needed. Someone would always be available to pick him up from school, to make sure he had food, to be there if he had nightmares or needed to talk. "We're going to make this official," Big Mac said. "I'll talk to a lawyer about temporary guardianship, and we'll work with the treatment center to make sure everything's above board." "You don't have to do all this," Marcus said, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. I'm nobody." Big Mac's face hardened. "Don't you ever say that again, you hear me? You are the son of a hero. You are family. And in this family, we don't turn our backs on each other. Not ever." The weeks that followed were some of the strangest and most wonderful of Marcus's life. He settled into Frank's spare room, which gradually transformed from a bare-bones space into something that felt like home. Elena brought over curtains. Whitey contributed a desk for homework. Another veteran showed up with a bookshelf and a collection of adventure novels that had belonged to his own son. Marcus enrolled in the local middle school, where he was initially an object of curiosity, the new kid living with the old Marine from the VFW. But the veterans had a presence in Ridgewood, and word spread quickly that Marcus was under their protection. The other students treated him with a cautious respect that gradually warmed into genuine friendship. Frank turned out to be a surprisingly good guardian. He was gruff and sometimes impatient, with a military directness that took some getting used to. But he was also reliable, consistent, and deeply caring in his own way. He made sure Marcus ate 3 meals a day. He helped with homework, even though his own education had ended at high school. He was there every single day, asking no more than that Marcus do his best. Every Thursday night, Marcus went to the VFW hall. It became his second home, this wood-paneled room full of aging warriors. They taught him things his father had never had the chance to teach him. Big Mac showed him how to tie knots that would hold under pressure. Elena taught him basic first aid. Whitey shared stories of his time at sea that left Marcus wide-eyed with wonder. But it was not all smooth sailing. There were hard days too. Marcus had nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night, sweating and disoriented, unable to shake the feeling that he was still alone, still abandoned, still cold. Frank would hear him through the thin walls and come in with a glass of water, sitting on the edge of the bed until Marcus calmed down. There were days when the grief hit him like a wave, leaving him unable to function. He would think about his father and the unfairness of his death, or he would think about his mother and wonder if she would ever really get better, or he would think about all the things he had lost and feel like he was drowning in sorrow. On those days, the veterans were his lifeline. They did not try to fix him or minimize his pain. They simply sat with him, these men and women who understood suffering intimately and let him know that he was not alone. Marcus also struggled with anger. He was angry at the world for taking his father, angry at his mother for leaving him, angry at himself for not being able to hold things together. The anger would bubble up at unexpected moments, and sometimes he would lash out, saying things he did not mean. Frank took it all in stride. "You've got a right to be angry," he told Marcus one night after a particularly difficult outburst. "What happened to you was wrong. It shouldn't have happened. But anger is like fire. You can let it consume you, or you can learn to channel it into something useful." "How?" Marcus asked, his voice sullen. "That's what we're going to figure out together." They started running in the mornings. It was Frank's idea, a way to burn off some of Marcus's restless energy. At first, Marcus hated it. He was out of shape, and the early mornings were brutal. But Frank was relentless, dragging him out of bed even when he protested. Slowly, things improved. Marcus discovered that running gave him a sense of control over his body that he had not felt in a long time. The physical exhaustion helped quiet the chaos in his mind, and there was something about the rhythm of it, one foot in front of the other, breath in, breath out, that felt almost meditative. After a month, Marcus could run 2 miles without stopping. After 2 months, he joined the school's track team. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. For the first time in a long time, he was part of something. He belonged. Meanwhile, the veterans continued their work behind the scenes. Big Mac had connections in veterans services, and he used every one of them to help Linda Johnson's case. They arranged for her treatment to be extended when it became clear she needed more time. They helped her start the process of applying for veterans' survivor benefits, money that should have been hers all along. They even found her a potential job waiting when she completed her program, a position with a veterans non-profit that understood her situation. Marcus and Linda spoke on the phone every week. The calls were sometimes difficult. Linda was doing hard work in treatment, confronting demons that had plagued her for years. She was not always at her best, and there were days when she cried more than she talked. But she was fighting. Marcus could hear it in her voice, the determination that had been missing for so long. His mother was coming back to him, one day at a time. 3 months into his stay with Frank, Marcus had a visit that changed everything. It was a Saturday afternoon, grey and cold, but without the biting wind that had characterized the winter so far. Marcus was in his room doing homework, algebra problems that he actually enjoyed because they had clear answers, when he heard Frank answer the door. There was a murmur of voices, low and serious, and then Frank called out, "Marcus, can you come here, please?" The tone of Frank's voice made Marcus's stomach tighten. It was not the casual tone Frank used for everyday matters. It was the tone he used when something important was about to happen. Marcus closed his algebra book and walked into the living room, bracing himself for whatever news awaited. He stopped dead in his tracks. Standing in Frank's doorway was a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair that fell to her shoulders and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she looked at him. Next to her was a man about the same age, tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses, and a face that looked like it had been carved from worry and grief and something that might have been hope. They were looking at Marcus with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, like they were trying to memorize every detail of his face, like they were seeing something in him that transcended the ordinary moment. "Marcus," Frank said carefully, his voice measured and slow, "this is Patricia and Robert Johnson. They're your grandparents." The air left Marcus's lungs in a rush. He stood there, unable to move, unable to speak, as the world rearranged itself around this new information. He had known, abstractly, that he had grandparents. His father had mentioned them occasionally, though the references were always vague and tinged with something that might have been pain or anger or regret. Marcus had never pressed for details because he could see that the subject hurt his father, and he did not want to cause more pain. There were no photographs of them in their house, no birthday cards or Christmas presents, no phone calls on special occasions. It was as if Derek's parents had existed in some other dimension, real but unreachable, present but permanently distant. Now here they were, standing in Frank's living room, looking at him like he was a ghost who had suddenly materialized before their eyes. "Hello, Marcus," Patricia said, her voice trembling with emotion she was clearly fighting to control. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." The story came out over the next few hours. Patricia and Robert Johnson had lost touch with their son Derek over a decade ago, the result of a falling out that had never been resolved. They had not known about his marriage, about Marcus's birth, about any of it. When Derek died, they had not been notified. They only found out months later through a chance encounter with an old family friend. By then, Linda and Marcus had already lost their home. The grandparents had been searching for their grandson ever since, but Linda's constant moving had made her impossible to track. It was not until the VFW started making inquiries about Linda Johnson that the pieces finally connected. A social worker at the treatment center had mentioned that the patient's son was staying with veterans in Ridgewood, and that information had eventually made its way to Patricia and Robert. "We should have tried harder," Robert said, his voice heavy with regret. "We should have made up with Derek while we had the chance. Now he's gone and we can never take back the years we lost." Marcus did not know what to feel. These strangers claimed to be his family, but they were strangers all the same. His father had never talked about why they were estranged, and Marcus did not want to ask questions that might reopen old wounds. "What do you want?" Marcus asked finally. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "We want to know you. We want to be part of your life if you'll let us. We know we can never replace what you've lost, but we'd like the chance to be your grandparents." Marcus looked at Frank, who had been sitting quietly through the whole conversation. The older man gave him a slight nod. "I'll think about it," Marcus said. It was not an acceptance, but it was not a rejection either. Patricia and Robert seemed to understand. They left their contact information and promised to wait for as long as Marcus needed. That night, Marcus called his mother to tell her about the visit. Linda was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Your father had his reasons for staying away from them," she said slowly, "but those were his reasons, not yours. You have a right to make your own decisions about who's in your life." "Are you mad that they showed up?" "No, baby. I'm tired of being mad. I'm tired of holding on to things that hurt me. If your grandparents can be good to you, then maybe that's a blessing." Marcus thought about that conversation for a long time. He was not ready to embrace Patricia and Robert as family, not yet, but he was willing to give them a chance. That was more than he would have been capable of a few months ago. Spring came to Ridgewood with a rush of warmth and color. The trees along Maple Street burst into bloom, and the VFW Hall's parking lot was filled with veterans washing their cars and enjoying the sunshine. Marcus had changed since that frozen December night. He was taller, for one thing, having hit a growth spurt that left Frank scrambling to keep him in clothes that fit. But the changes went deeper than that. He smiled more. He laughed easier. The haunted look that had been in his eyes when Frank first found him was slowly fading, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. He was also making friends at school. There was a boy named Tyler who was on the track team with him, and a girl named Amara who sat next to him in English class. They did not know the full story of Marcus's past, and he was not ready to share it. But they accepted him as he was, awkward and guarded, and slowly learning to trust again. His relationship with his grandparents was also evolving. After several more visits, Marcus had agreed to spend a weekend at their home in Columbus. It had been strange at first, staying in a house filled with photographs of his father as a child, reminders of a life that had existed before Marcus was even a possibility. But Patricia and Robert were patient and kind. They did not try to buy his affection or push him to feel things he was not ready to feel. They simply made space for him in their lives and let him fill it at his own pace. Marcus learned things about his father that he had never known. He saw Derek's childhood bedroom, still decorated with posters of bands from the 80s. He heard stories about Derek's years on the high school football team, his rebellious teenage phase, his determination to join the military despite his parents' objections. He also learned about the fight that had torn the family apart. It had been about the military in the end. Patricia and Robert had not wanted their son to enlist, had pleaded with him to go to college instead. Derek had refused, and harsh words were said on both sides. After he left for basic training, the communication had just stopped. "We were stubborn," Robert admitted. "Proud. We thought we were right, but being right doesn't matter when it costs you your only son." Marcus understood, in a way that he could not have articulated. He had his own relationship with stubbornness and pride. He knew how easy it was to let anger harden into something permanent. "Dad was stubborn too," Marcus said. "But he was also brave, and he loved me. That's what I'm going to remember." The day Linda Johnson completed her treatment program was one of the best days of Marcus's life. It was also one of the most terrifying, because he was not sure who would walk out of those doors. Would it be the mother he remembered from before? the one who made pancakes on Saturday mornings and helped with homework? Or would it be the stranger who had replaced her, the one who disappeared into bottles and left notes on gas station receipts? The entire VFW turned out for the occasion. They rented a bus and drove 3 hours to Toledo, filling the treatment center's visiting room with grizzled veterans who had come to welcome one of their own back to the world. It was an unlikely honor guard, these men and women with their military bearing and their weathered faces, but they stood at attention with the same pride they would show at any official ceremony. When Linda walked into the room, she looked like a different person. She had gained weight, healthy weight that filled out her cheeks and softened the sharp angles that had made her look skeletal in the last months of her decline. Her skin had color again, a warm glow that replaced the grayish pallor of addiction. Her eyes were clear and bright, without the fog that had clouded them for so long, without the desperate emptiness that had made Marcus feel like he was looking at a stranger wearing his mother's face. She was wearing clothes that fit, a blue sweater and dark jeans that someone at the center had helped her pick out. Her hair was neat, pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she held herself with a dignity that Marcus had not seen since before his father died. There was still fragility there, still the sense that she was holding herself together by force of will, but there was also strength. Real strength. But none of that mattered as much as the look on her face when she saw Marcus. It was a look of such profound love and relief and gratitude that it made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides, her composure crumbling with each step, and pulled him into her arms. She held him like she was afraid he might disappear, like she was trying to make up for all the times she had not been there, like her arms could somehow undo the damage that her absence had caused. Marcus held her back just as tightly, and for a long moment neither of them could speak. They just stood there in the middle of the room, mother and son, 2 people who had lost everything and found each other again. The veterans watched in respectful silence. These warriors who had seen so much, and more than a few of them had to look away to compose themselves. "I'm so sorry," Linda whispered finally, the words muffled against Marcus's shoulder. "I'm so sorry for everything." "It's okay, Mom, you're here now. That's all that matters." The reunion was emotional and messy and perfect. Linda hugged every single veteran who had come, thanking them through her tears for taking care of her son when she could not. Big Mac cried openly, his massive shoulders shaking. Eleanor held Linda's hands and told her about the resources available for her continued recovery. Whitey cracked jokes that broke the tension and made everyone laugh. Frank hung back, watching the scene with a complicated expression. He had grown attached to Marcus over the past months, and the boy's departure would leave a hole in his quiet life. But this was how it should be. A mother reunited with her son, a family beginning to heal. Linda noticed Frank standing apart and walked over to him. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Frank nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just did what any of us would do." "No," Linda said firmly. "You gave my son a home when I couldn't. You showed him what good men look like. That's not nothing. That's everything." She hugged him, and Frank let her, his arms coming up slowly to return the embrace. Over her shoulder he caught Marcus's eye. The boy was smiling, a real smile, the kind that reached all the way to his eyes. Things were going to be okay. The transition was not immediate. Linda moved into a transitional housing program in Ridgewood, one that allowed her to stay close to the support system they had built. She got the job that the veterans had arranged for her, an administrative position with a Veterans Services non-profit, and she threw herself into the work with the dedication of someone who understood what was at stake. Marcus stayed with Frank for another month while Linda got settled. Then, slowly, he began spending more time at his mother's new apartment. A night here, a weekend there, until finally they were ready to make it official. The day Marcus moved in with his mother permanently, Frank helped carry the boxes. There were not many, mostly clothes and books, and the few possessions Marcus had accumulated during his time in Ridgewood. They fit easily into the second bedroom of Linda's small apartment. "You know you can come back any time," Frank said, standing in the doorway. "My door's always open." "I know." Marcus stuck out his hand, then changed his mind and hugged Frank instead. "Thank you for everything. I won't forget." Frank hugged him back hard, then cleared his throat and stepped away. "Thursday nights at the VFW, don't be a stranger." "I won't." And he was not. Every Thursday night, Marcus showed up at the VFW hall, joining the veterans for dinner and stories and the sense of belonging that had saved his life. The men and women there watched him grow over the months and years that followed, marking his progress with the same pride they would show for their own children. They celebrated when Marcus made the varsity track team. They cheered when he won his first race. They helped him study for his driver's test and were waiting in the parking lot when he passed. They showed up at his graduation, filling an entire row in the auditorium. 30 veterans in their best suits and decorated caps, applauding louder than anyone. Through all of it, Marcus never forgot where he had come from or who had helped him get to where he was going. Years later, Marcus stood at a podium in the Ridgewood VFW hall, looking out at a crowd of familiar faces. He was 22 years old now, a senior in college, about to graduate with a degree in social work. He had been asked to speak at the annual Veterans Day celebration, to share his story with the community. Big Mac was in the front row, grayer now, but still built like a tank. Elena and Miguel sat beside him, holding hands. Whitey was there, and a dozen other veterans who had been part of that fateful Thursday night a decade ago. Frank sat in the back, trying to be inconspicuous, but Marcus caught his eye and smiled. Linda was there too, sitting with Patricia and Robert Johnson. The three of them had built an unexpected friendship over the years, united by their love for Marcus and their determination to honor Derek's memory. Marcus cleared his throat and began to speak. 10 years ago, I sat outside this hall in the cold, too scared to come inside. I was 12 years old. I was homeless. I had lost my father, and I thought I had lost my mother too. I had nothing left except the stories my dad used to tell me about this place, about the VFW, about the Brotherhood of Veterans. He paused, looking at the faces watching him. I didn't know if those stories were true. I didn't know if anyone would help me or if I would be turned away. But I came anyway, because I had nowhere else to go. Marcus smiled, feeling the emotion rising in his chest. What I found that night changed my life. I found a room full of men and women who had served their country and who believed that service didn't end when you took off the uniform. I found people who looked at a scared, hungry kid and saw not a burden, but a mission. I found family. The room was silent, but it was a warm silence, full of memories shared. My father used to say that the bonds forged in the military could never be broken. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I experienced it for myself. These veterans took me in when I had nothing. They fed me. They clothed me. They gave me a bed to sleep in. They found my mother and helped her get the treatment she needed. They helped me believe that I was worth saving. Marcus looked at Frank, who was trying very hard not to cry. I'm graduating from college this spring with a degree in social work. I'm going to spend my life helping kids like me, kids who have fallen through the cracks, kids who have been failed by systems and circumstances beyond their control. I'm going to do this because of what I learned here in this room. I learned that kindness matters. I learned that community matters. I learned that when you see someone in need, you don't walk by, you stop, you help, you give. He took a deep breath. To the veterans in this room and to veterans everywhere, thank you. Thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for showing me what it really means to serve. It's not just about wearing a uniform or carrying a weapon. It's about looking out for each other. It's about making sure no one gets left behind. It's about love in action. Marcus paused, gathering himself for the final words. My father was a hero. He saved lives in Afghanistan, but he's not the only hero in my story. There are 30 heroes in this room right now, men and women who saved my life on a cold December night, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. The applause that followed was thunderous. Veterans rose to their feet, some of them crying openly, all of them moved by the words of the boy they had saved, who had become a man they could be proud of. Frank pushed through the crowd to reach Marcus, pulling him into a bear hug that nearly crushed his ribs. Your father would be proud of you, Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. So damn proud. I know, Marcus said. I feel him here every time I walk through those doors. He led me to this place, and you guys did the rest. The celebration continued late into the night. There was food and laughter and stories, so many stories. Marcus heard tales about his father that he had never known, adventures and mishaps, and moments of bravery that painted a fuller picture of the man Derek Johnson had been. He also made a promise to himself. When he finished his degree and started his career, he would come back to Ridgewood. He would volunteer at the VFW. He would help other kids the way he had been helped. The cycle of service would continue, generation to generation, an unbroken chain of care. Linda found him near the end of the night, sitting at one of the tables with a cup of coffee, watching the veterans clean up. You did good tonight, she said, sitting down beside him. Thanks, Mom. She put her arm around his shoulders, something she had not done since he was a child. I know I wasn't there for you when you needed me most. I know I can never fully make up for that. But watching you become the person you are, seeing you turn our tragedy into something meaningful, it makes me believe that maybe something good can come out of something terrible. Marcus leaned into her embrace. We made it, Mom, both of us, together. Together, Linda agreed, and with a lot of help from 30 stubborn veterans who wouldn't take no for an answer. They laughed, and the sound was a healing thing. Outside, the December wind had returned, cold and sharp as it had been 10 years ago, but inside the VFW hall there was only warmth. The warmth of community, the warmth of family, the warmth of love, given freely and without conditions. Marcus Johnson had come to this place as a broken child with nothing. He was leaving as a man with everything that mattered. And he knew with absolute certainty that this was not an ending. It was just the beginning. The VFW Hall in Ridgewood became something of a legend in the years that followed. Stories of what those veterans did for Marcus Johnson spread through the community and beyond, inspiring others to acts of kindness they might not otherwise have considered. But for Marcus, the legacy was personal. He graduated from college at the top of his class and immediately went to work for a non-profit organization that served homeless youth. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the pay was modest. But every time Marcus helped a scared kid find shelter, every time he connected a struggling family with resources, every time he sat with someone who had lost hope and helped them find it again, he thought of that cold December night. He thought of Frank's gruff kindness. He thought of Big Mac's booming voice, promising that he was family. He thought of Eleanor's gentle hands checking him for frostbite. He thought of 30 veterans who had looked at a homeless boy and seen not a problem to be solved, but a person to be loved. That was the real miracle of that night, not magic or supernatural intervention, just human beings being good to each other, just people deciding that they would not let a child suffer alone. Marcus carried that lesson with him everywhere he went. It informed the way he treated the people he served and the colleagues he worked with. It shaped his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Years turned into decades. Marcus married a woman named Sarah who shared his commitment to service. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, whom they named Derek and Elena after the people who had shaped their lives most profoundly. The VFW veterans watched the family grow with the pride of grandparents. Those who were still alive came to every baptism, every birthday party, every graduation. They were not blood relatives, but they were family in every way that mattered. Frank Delgado lived to see Marcus's children born. He held baby Derek in his arms with the same gentle care he had shown Marcus all those years ago, his weathered face soft with wonder. "Another generation," he said quietly. "Your dad would have loved this." "I think he knows," Marcus said. "Somehow, I think he knows." Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, surrounded by friends from the VFW. He left his house to Marcus in his will, along with a letter that Marcus would keep in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. The letter said, "Dear Marcus, when I found you outside the VFW hall that night, I thought I was saving you, but the truth is, you saved me. I had lost my purpose after leaving the service. I was just going through the motions, waiting for the end. Then you came along, and suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning. Being your guardian was the greatest honor of my life. Watching you grow into the man you've become gives me more pride than any medal I ever earned. Take care of yourself, kid. Take care of your family, and take care of the next generation of lost kids who need someone to believe in them. You were always worth saving. Don't ever forget that. Semper Fi, Frank." Marcus read the letter at Frank's funeral, standing before an honor guard of veterans who had come from across the country to pay their respects. The VFW hall was packed to overflowing, and the service lasted for hours as person after person rose to share their memories of the man who had touched so many lives. It was, Marcus realized, a fitting tribute, not just to Frank, but to all the veterans who had been part of his journey. They had shown him what it meant to serve with honor, to sacrifice for others, to never leave anyone behind. And now it was his turn to carry that torch forward. Marcus returned to Ridgewood after Frank's funeral and took over as the unofficial liaison between the VFW and the community's youth services. He established a mentorship program that paired veterans with at-risk kids, providing the kind of support and guidance that had made such a difference in his own life. The program grew and flourished, spreading to VFW posts across the state and eventually across the country. Marcus traveled to speak about the initiative, sharing his story with audiences who listened with tears in their eyes and determination in their hearts. But no matter how far his work took him, Marcus always came back to Ridgewood, back to the VFW hall on the corner of Maple Street and Veterans Boulevard, back to the place where his life had changed forever. On the 10th anniversary of Frank's death, Marcus brought his children to the hall to show them where their father's story had begun. Derek was 8 now, and Elena was 6, old enough to understand some of what they were seeing. Marcus walked them around the room, pointing out the photographs on the walls, the memorabilia from conflicts spanning more than a century. He showed them the corner where he used to sit, listening to stories from veterans who had seen things no person should ever have to see. He showed them the spot outside where Frank had found him, curled against the brick wall, nearly frozen, completely alone. "This is where I was sitting," Marcus said, crouching down to their level. "I was 12 years old. I had nothing and no one. I was scared and hungry and cold." "What happened, Daddy?" Elena asked, her eyes wide. "A man named Frank Delgado found me. He brought me inside and introduced me to a room full of veterans, and those veterans took care of me. They gave me food and shelter and love. They helped me find my mom, and they helped her get better. They became my family." "Like Grandma Linda and Great-Grandma Patricia?" Derek asked. "Exactly like that. Family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up for you when you need them most. It's about the people who love you even when you're at your worst. It's about choosing to take care of each other no matter what. Marcus stood up and looked out the window at the parking lot where Frank had once parked his old truck. The wind was blowing, rustling the American flag that still hung from the pole outside, but the cold had no power over the warmth in his heart. "Your grandfather Derek was a hero," Marcus continued. "He served his country and saved lives in Afghanistan. But he wasn't the only hero in our family's story. There were 30 heroes in this room who saved me. And Frank Delgado, the man this building is now named after, was the greatest hero of all." The children nodded solemnly, understanding in their own way the weight of what their father was telling them. "I brought you here today because I want you to remember this place," Marcus said. "I want you to remember what it stands for. When you see someone who needs help, I want you to think of those veterans. I want you to ask yourself what they would do, and then I want you to do it." Derek looked up at his father with serious eyes. "I will, Dad, I promise." "Me too," Elena added. Marcus smiled and pulled his children close. The legacy would continue. The chain of service and sacrifice and love would remain unbroken. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Inside the VFW hall, a new group of veterans was gathering for their Thursday night meeting, carrying on the traditions that had meant so much to so many. Marcus Johnson had walked into this hall as a homeless boy with nothing but desperation and a vague hope. He was walking out as a man who had everything that mattered, surrounded by the love of family, both blood and chosen. And somewhere, he liked to believe, his father and Frank were watching, smiling, proud of the man he had become and the legacy he was building. The story of the homeless boy and the 30 veterans did not end that cold December night. It continued, rippling outward like waves in a pond, touching lives that would never know where the kindness had originated. But Marcus knew, he would always know, and he would spend every day of his life making sure that knowledge meant something. Making sure that no child ever had to sit alone in the cold, hoping someone would care enough to help. Making sure that the love he had received was passed on, multiplied, shared with everyone who needed it. That was his mission now. That was his service. That was his way of honoring all the heroes who had made his life possible. And he would never, ever stop. The wind continued to blow outside the VFW hall, but inside there was only warmth, the warmth of memory, the warmth of gratitude, the warmth of a story that had started with despair and ended with hope. A story that proved, once and for all, that kindness could change the world. One homeless boy at a time. One act of love at a time. One moment of grace at a time. That was the power of community. That was the power of service. That was the power of people who refused to look away from suffering and chose instead to reach out with open hands and open hearts. Marcus Johnson understood that power now. He had been saved by it, and he would spend the rest of his life sharing it with everyone he met. Because that was what the veterans had taught him. That was what his father had taught him. That was what love in its purest form had always been about. Not keeping it safe and protected, but giving it away freely and without reservation to everyone who needed it. Even a homeless boy sitting in the cold. Especially a homeless boy sitting in the cold. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. That was the truth that had restored everyone's faith. And it would never, ever be forgotten. The end